Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for being here. And we are so happy to have the folks from NALP with us this afternoon. They're going to talk to us about their study of U.S. law school alumni and employment satisfaction, which of course is important to all of our areas in the law school. So we're just so grateful for them to be here today. And then at the end of their presentation, we're going to go into breakout sessions hosted by some of our awesome executive board members for Alumni Relations, Communications, and Development. So please stick around so you'll have the opportunity to discuss what they present with your people. I'll kick it over to Nalp. Thank you.
So thank you, Heather and Jamie. We're excited to be back with our AALS friends. We know you have a full day ahead of you, so we'll jump right in. My name is Skip Horne. I am the Vice President for Engagement for the NALP Foundation, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Fiona Trevelyan Hornblower, President and CEO, and Jennifer Mandery, Vice President for Research. As Heather said, today we're going to share some highlights from one of our most popular annual research studies, and that's our Law School Alumni Employment and Satisfaction Study, a joint study that we conduct with NALP, which surveys law school alumni 3 years out from graduation from both U.S. and Canadian law schools. So we'll be sharing some data specific to the class of 2020, as well as a few trends from over 10 years of the survey. And we're particularly excited about this year's study because it's the first look at the first class to study in, graduate into, and start their careers during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to present a lot of information today, and don't feel the need to jot everything down. We're happy to share a copy of our PowerPoint with the section after our presentation. So just by way of background, we launched this study with NALP to query alumni well beyond the 10-month mark that's currently mandated by the ABA, and really specifically to explore more deeply some topics like career satisfaction, alumni engagement, and more generally return on investment in legal education. We launched the first beta study with the class of 2010, and we've been conducting the survey every year since. And then we expanded that to include Canadian law schools in 2017. Every fall, the deans of all the ABA-accredited law schools in the US and Canada receive an invitation to participate in the study. The contact at each school receives a unique survey link that they then distribute to their alumni, and all the data comes directly back to us and, of course, is kept anonymous and confidential. And let me just make a quick thank you to Access Lex Institute for their support of the alumni study. We're in year 3 of a multi-year grant to expand the participation of law schools in the alumni study to the 6 HBCU law schools, as well as a number of additional schools with underrepresented student and alumni populations. The alumni study itself is quite fulsome. We cover a lot of topics, as you can see here. Today, we're just going to highlight a few of these areas, and if you're interested in the rest of the study, of course, we encourage you to purchase your copy on the NALP Foundation website. So here's a quick snapshot of this year's alumni study. We received responses from over 1,500 alumni from across the US and Canada. Some of our new questions this year focus on the number of required days in the office, which is in addition to the questions we've been asking for the last couple of years about work environment, and leadership transparency and communication as a factor of career satisfaction. And we've continued to query such areas as the pandemic effect, educational debt, and professional identity formation. So to get us started, it's my pleasure to introduce Fiona Trevelyan Hornblower, President and CEO of the NALP Foundation. Fiona?
Thanks so much, Skip, and it is wonderful to be with you all today and to share some of this intriguing data. So obviously, as Skip mentioned, one of the things we were really particularly curious about is what were the impacts going to be, if there were any, that were discernibly different for this class of 2020 heading into the launch of their careers with the full pandemic alongside them. So we will be digging into some of this in more detail, but we thought it'd be helpful just to show you sort of a quick summary. So we did see that there was actually strong alignment with the results that we have seen from prior studies in a number of key areas, including the number of jobs these folks have held by 3 years out, the levels of overall job satisfaction, and we continue to see relatively stable numbers of those reporting compensation over $300,000. That's really driven by the folks who are at the largest law firms. We did, however, see some shifts in the data that we'll be going into as well. We saw a decrease in the mobility reported by associates of color. So mobility simply means how many times they have moved positions in that 3 years. We also saw a continued decline in the intention of folks to seek a new job. Not surprisingly, fewer reported they are working fully remotely. We're seeing many organizations now shifting either to a hybrid system or to fully return to the office. We did see female average educational debt increase, as well as I mentioned, the number of graduates working completely in the office. So where are these graduates? These are your future major donors that you were just talking about how to connect with. We want to help you know where they are, what they're doing, and how you can tailor your messaging to them. So first, the very good news. We had a very high level of employment reported. Now, there's a lot of attention that gets given to the employment at graduation and at the 10-month ABA and NALP reporting deadline. But this is really interesting because it shows us that by 3 years out, 97%, and this has been true for the last couple of years as well, 97% of these alumni are employed after graduation. So that's great news. So when either students or even younger alumni are asking that question, will I get a job? Yes, you and your law school colleagues can be confident that the vast majority of these folks are going to be gainfully employed after graduation 3 years out. But then we want to parse it a little bit more finely and ask, are they practicing law? Are they deploying the JD degrees that they and everybody else has struggled so mightily for them to have? And again, we see a very high percentage, 87% reporting that they are practicing law. So a little bit lower than that overall employment figure, but still very high at 87%. Interestingly, we have seen an increase, as you can see on this graph, overall since the class of 2011 in the figures reporting that they are practicing law. This has steadily climbed. So I want to parse this out a little bit more carefully for you all. The blue line that you'll see is the total number of all the alumni participating in the study. So we'll see that blue line with some bobs and weaves is really in a very nice steady upward trajectory. We do see a little bit of a divergence though when we look at white graduates, the red line, versus graduates of color. While the red line has continued that upward trajectory, we've seen over the last couple of years at the green line, graduates of color, we are seeing an increasing gap between the reported levels practicing law for white associates, alumni and graduates of color. So that's something that we all want to keep an eye on going forward. When we parse this out by gender and by various racial and ethnic groups, we see there's very little difference between males and females. 87% of males report that they are practicing law, 88% female. We had 63% of non-binary reporting that, but that's a relatively small cohort, so that particular number should be viewed somewhat with caution. We see a little bit more divergence, though, when we look at white graduates at 89% versus graduates of color at 84%. And when we break out that graduates of color, we see some even more significant divergences between various different cohorts here. So, for example, at the relatively low end, we've got Black or African American graduates, 73% of them reporting that they are practicing law. That climbs to 79% for Asian graduates. We have relatively small numbers in the Native American or Native Alaskan and Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander self-reporting categories, so they are at 100%. But more compelling are the stats around multiracial at 89% and Latinx at 94%. So we know these folks are working. We know the vast majority of them are practicing law. How are they practicing law? Well, a little bit over half are in private law firms. That's far and away the location or the type of practice most of your alumni are engaged in, followed closely by 13% both in business or corporations and in government, with a smattering of folks in a variety of other different types of work settings, including public interest, public defenders, prosecutors, and education and judicial clerkships. When we break this out a little bit further by gender and also white graduates of color compared to white graduates compared to graduates of color, we do see some slight divergences by gender, particularly in the business and corporation area, where we have more males reporting that they're working in that work setting than we do female. And we see the reverse in the figures reporting that they are working in government, with more females reporting that at 15% than males at 12%. We see larger gaps start to emerge when we compare white graduates versus graduates of color. Again, in business and corporations, we see only 11% of graduates of color, white graduates reporting that rather, and 17% of graduates of color. And then when we look down a little bit further, we see for public defenders, we're seeing 12% for white graduates and 4% for graduates of color. Breaking out the specific cohorts within graduates of color, we again see some divergences here as well. Law firm practice, as I mentioned, top across the board, but for Asian and for Black or African American ones, we see business and corporations really rising up to be one of the top employment sources for them, so at 21 and 23%. We see a number of cohorts reporting relatively high levels of employment in government, 8% for Asian, 18% for Black or African American, and 13% for Latinx. Interestingly, for the MENA graduates, we see 46% in law firms, but also 46% in business or corporations, so an interesting divergence there. And then finally, when we look at where the class of 2020 is sitting based on LGBTQ plus status or disability status, we see again the top is the law firm as the locus for just under half of those self-identifying as LGBTQ plus. A little bit lower, 37% for those who self-identify as having a disability, with government coming in then close behind at 15 and 19% for those cohorts, followed by business and corporations at 12% for both. So this slide is the very good news. Overall, we're seeing very high levels of satisfaction for these alumni with their current job. You'll see just under half say they're actually extremely satisfied, and then another goodly chunk, 38%, are saying they are somewhat satisfied. So we have very limited numbers of folks that 3 years out are actually not happy with the position that they have at the time that they were interviewed. So we also give folks the opportunity to share with us in their own words what the relative value of law school was for them. So it's not surprising, we got lots of comments that it was helpful for preparing for the bar exam, but also they also comment that it helped them develop broad skills, including networking, and they particularly point to the value of experiential education, as well as the key role of faculty. And then finally, it's provided them with a key professional network. So these are things that you can key into when you are thinking about the messaging that you're using with graduates, as these are some of the things that they are telling us, and therefore you, what are the things that are most valuable as they look back at their law school experience and what their law schools gave them. Now, because this is the first pandemic class, they also had some things to share about what it felt like to graduate into that. And not surprisingly, there were a lot of them who are not happy campers because they missed out on some of the key milestones for this, particularly graduation ceremonies and recognition. And we know that that was tough for law schools to figure out how to navigate that. But as you're thinking about the messaging for this group, it bears remembering that they had this experience of feeling like they didn't get that particular celebration or recognition that they had worked so hard for and anticipated. There was also, a number or a certain level of concern articulated that they felt abandoned. There weren't the resources that they would have hoped for. It was a little bit more challenging for them to try and land those positions, and they probably were looking to overall strained resources at law schools, such like career services, and not feeling that they were getting the support that they would have liked to have received at that time when they were trying to launch their careers, recognizing the larger pandemic environment. So mobility, as I mentioned, this just means how many jobs have these folks had in the relatively short period of time, 3 years since they graduated. So we're actually seeing very high levels of mobility for these folks. They reported the bulk of them, 70% report that they have already had 2 or more positions by this relatively junior point in their careers. That's actually up from what we've seen historically. It's usually hovered around 2/3. So we did see that increase. Whether it is directly attributable to the pandemic, we're not sure at this point. So we'll need the data points from the upcoming class to see if we're continuing to see a climb in mobility. But these people have hopped a relatively frequent number of times since they left your law schools. When we take a look at that historic perspective, we just wanted to show this to you. So as you'll see, it's been relatively steady, hovering at around that 66 percentage point that I mentioned, with 2/3 of graduates reporting 2 or more positions across the board. The one exception, as you'll see, is the graduates of color line, the orange one. That has traditionally been higher, or historically been higher, than the mobility level for their majority peers. It plummeted during the pandemic with the class of 2017. They were actually interviewed in 2020, 3 years out after graduation, but it has then climbed back above the general reported mobility level, but now is dovetailing again with both this class, where it was very, very close, and also for the prior class. So we're going to be watching that one carefully to see if it continues to dovetail, or if we see divergences again between the mobility rates for graduates of color and their majority peers. As I mentioned, we had very low levels of these folks reporting that they are actively seeking new positions. So that means that they are the ones out there. They're not just sort of passively receiving calls from headhunters, et cetera. It got to a historic low this year of 11%. As you'll see, it's been steadily declining over the last decade that we've been doing this. That's good news in that they are a little bit more contented, but we have to compare that with the overall mobility levels that I just shared. When we break the intention to seek a new job out by cohort, we also see some interesting divergences in the data here. Very little difference by gender, male 13% reporting that, female just a little bit lower at 12%, 50% of non-binary though, reporting that they are actively seeking a new job. White graduates, 11%, right at that national level. A little bit higher, 16% for graduates of color. And again, looking at this within specific demographic cohorts, we see that 21 and 22% of Asian and Black or African American graduates report that they are actively seeking another job. So that's nearly twice the level of the national average and of their majority peers. We see slightly lower, but still higher than the national averages for MENA, and then multiracial quite close at 12%. And then, as I mentioned, given the small numbers for the Native American, Native Alaskan, Hawaiian, or the Pacific Islander populations, 33%, but we want to view those figures with caution. So we know they're working. We know they're relatively happy where they're working. So why are they changing jobs? Why are we seeing this high level of mobility? So we're going to walk through a couple of the reasons that the alumni shared with us. Not surprisingly, for those of you in law schools, better compensation and bonuses is the driver for 59% who say they're looking to make a move, as are better benefits. Community and development reasons also, though, rise to the top here. And the interesting thing for us in looking at this data is that there's a relatively narrow band when you look at the percentages reported for all of these. So attitude or fit concerns at 41%, better support for work-life balance at 38%, looking for mentors or role models at 34%. Skipping down to this bottom one, better support for well-being and mental health. That's over half of the responding graduates saying that that is a driver for job changes. So as you're having conversations with alumni, you can be attentive to which of these drivers are things that they are thinking about that may be leading them to think about making a change. Additionally, obviously, practice career factors come into play at a significant level, with the two primary leading ones being they're looking to pursue a specific practice area interest. So that could play out in a number of ways. It could be that they're looking to switch practice areas, or it could be that they're looking to deepen their engagement with a specific practice area and don't feel that they can do that at their current organization. The second one is really intriguing. If they don't see clear advancement paths, so there isn't a prospect of development for them, that's something that makes them start thinking very much about whether they need to make a job change. And then about a fifth of them are saying they're thinking of changing to make a change to a different type of legal job. So we know that they're working, that they're practicing law, that they're changing jobs pretty frequently, and some of the reasons that we're doing. So now Jennifer is going to take us through a deeper dive into what some of the drivers are for these graduates. Jennifer.
Thank you, Fiona. So next, as she said, we'll look at some drivers and the impact they have on graduates, especially with their satisfaction with their jobs and careers at these early stages in their career. So first slide details educational debt. And again, this is educational debt out to 3 years post-graduation. And we can see that the significant levels of debts that many students incur, that this topic really has been of great concern. So we inquire graduates to let us know what that debt load they're carrying at this point in time. And we can see it's very high at this 3-year mark. For all graduates, that mean score is, or the mean level of debt is 95,000. And roughly 86% of that is attributable directly to law school. When we compare male and female, females have traditionally had higher levels. In this instance, with the class of 2020, it was about 102,000 versus 89,000 for male, and non-binary is a bit higher as well at 98,000. Troublingly, we consistently see graduates of color carry much higher levels of debt at this point. In this case, it's 122,000 versus 83,000 for graduates of color. And then when we look within graduates of color, we can see that that debt load really does vary quite a bit, with Asian graduates and multiracial graduates reporting the lowest levels of debt. When we look at LGBTQ graduates, they really do fall in line with all graduates overall, but those with disabilities carry much higher level at almost 110,000. And I'll also mention this range of debt really varies greatly. It's from zero debt all the way up to one poor individual had $450,000 worth of debt at this point. 42% of graduates are carrying debt of $100,000 or more at this point. And then on the happier side, we have 33% that reported no educational debt at this point. When we look at the impact of debt on job satisfaction, we do see that it has a modest correlation with the level. So if we look at those who are reporting that they are extremely satisfied or somewhat satisfied with their debt, the overall satisfaction for those who have zero debt level is at 89%. For those who are carrying a debt up to 100,000, it's at 86%. And then for those who are carrying debt for more than 100,000, it's at 83%. So it dips there as well. Alumni were asked to indicate their main effects of their educational debt, and they do report that they feel the weight of their debt in many different ways. It's influencing their job choice, but it's also having a significant impact on their life choices, such as delaying home ownership or when to have children, reduced credit scores, etc. We've broken out the debt levels here that graduates are carrying, and not surprisingly, as the debt level increases, we can see an inverse impact negatively on these graduates, and that's even including a negative impact on mental health and well-being. Fiona shared that we see high levels of this. I have another slide later on that I'll be showing that shows high levels of this too. Those who reported zero debt, it's at 2%. For those carrying up to 100,000, that increases or jumps to 44%. And then for those who have more than 100,000, over half the graduates are reporting this.
Jennifer, there's a question that popped in. Would you prefer to wait until the end?
We could answer it now.
It deals, I think, with this topic here about debt load. Someone wants to know whether or not there was a measurement on student loan forgiveness prevalence amongst law school graduates.
You know, we did not ask that in the survey this time, but it's really great to hear of what interest is, because we use this feedback to expand our survey each year. So we'll definitely take note of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So next we'll move on to total annual compensation for these graduates at this 3-year mark. So this next chart details annual compensation. It includes salary and bonus and profit sharing. And we'll see the bulk of graduates reported incomes generally between 76,000 and 200,000, with about 10% reporting incomes above that amount and 11% reporting incomes just below that amount. The bulk of them are at 101,000 to 150,000, with that 28%, and then followed with about a quarter with 76,000 to 100,000. This year, those reporting more than 300,000 is 6%, and that remains static from the years prior. With all the salary wars and high mobility and talent swirl that was occurring over the past few years, we had really started to see, although it's small, a lot of upticks in that more than 300,000 mark. The year prior to that, it was at 4%, and it had been at 2%. So we'll continue to watch and see if that changes at all moving forward. While the pandemic has waned troublingly, 34%, so a third of graduates are reporting that the pandemic continues to negatively affect their mental health and well-being. Now, the good news is that's slightly down from the class prior, for the class of 2019. For males and females, you can see it definitely has a larger impact on on females at 36%, and particularly women of color at 37% as well. Now, non-binary is at 100%, but again, the numbers are very low for this cohort, so that may impact the results. For LGBTQ graduates, it's at 50%, and those with a disability at 61%. So again, much higher for those cohorts as well. So we also want to note, we look at the data, we slice and dice it in many different ways, including current work positions as well as law school rank. And we do see many different variances in the data by law school cohorts. And here's just a list of some of them, including the number of jobs that are held. For example, we see those in the highest ranked schools have the greatest stability. Also, work settings, we see a linear correlation with this. The percent of graduates working in law firms progressively decreases with law school rank. Same with whether or not they decide to practice law. We see reported levels decline with school rank, although the vast majority of graduates are practicing law at this point. Also, compensation, the data showed increasing inverse impact as the law school rank declined. Both the median and the average debt loads climbed with law school rank as it fell. And then all this information is detailed in our full report that's available on our website. So next, we're going to move on to postgraduate law school engagement. So for several years, this study's probed alumni preferences for their postgraduate law school engagement with their schools. And we also take a look at some of the barriers that exist to their ongoing engagement. So we recognize that not all schools that participate in our study have comprehensive career-related resources and support available for their alumni. So first, let's look at the preferred methods for postgraduate employment. We can see too, I'll note that they've been very consistent over the last few years. Here are the rates for the class of 2020, and far and away the most popular method for alumni to engage with their school is networking events, and that's over half at 56%. And that's followed closely by mentoring programs at 45%. And then after that is alumni weekends and reunions with about a third. We have about a fourth of graduates who selected on-campus speaking opportunities or postgraduate career assistance, and student organizations and affinity groups as their preferred methods. However, the two most common methods that schools use for engaging with their alumni, including service and alumni association and financial contributions, were cited at the lowest levels at 15% as well as 7%. And then notably, we saw 5% of the alumni report that they did not want to remain engaged with their school in any of these ways. So we'll further break the data out. And when we look by gender in those gender identity in those first three columns, Preferences really did differ. While networking was consistently the preferred method for both females and males at 56 and 57%, male graduates preferred alumni weekends and reunions at higher rates in that top row at 39% versus 30% for male or females. And females identified mentoring programs at 48%, more often than their male peers at 42%. We also see that non-binary graduates gravitated towards mentoring programs and student organizations and affinity groups, both at 67% as their preferred engagement methods. The last two columns outline race and ethnicity. And here the data shows that graduates of color prefer networking events at higher levels at that 63 versus 53% for their white peers, as well as student organizations and affinity group events at 32% versus 21% for their white peers. And they valued mentoring programs slightly less and saw those to be slightly less interesting as a whole. So next we'll look at within graduates of color and networking events. If we look about 5 rows down right in the middle, we're the leading engagement mechanism across graduates, color of cohorts. Although there were some more important distinctions. For example, we really saw a range. We ranged from 0 mentions all the way up to 68% for Asian graduates. When we looked at financial contributions, that 3rd row down, Black or African American and multiracial graduates cited these at higher rates at 11% and 9%, although the level is still quite low, while even fewer Latinx and Asian graduates cited these at 1% and 2%. And additionally, Asian graduates identified on-campus speaking opportunities and service in alumni organizations, far less than their peers did. And MENA graduates had the lowest rates for alumni weekends and reunions and student organization and affinity groups as well. When we look at some additional demographic cohorts, LGBTQ plus graduates preferred mentoring programs and networking events equally, each at 51%, and identified student organizations or affinity groups at even higher rates, 34% versus 25% than their overall group of class of 2020 peers did. Within graduates who have disabilities, they mentioned mentoring programs at the top at 48%, so that's nearly half, and that was followed by networking events at 43%. This cohort also identified alumni weekends and reunions at lower levels when compared to their overall class, so at 23% versus 33% overall. So next we'll look at some of the barriers to engagement. And again, relatively, we've been tracking this for 3 years. We really have seen historically the results to be very consistent. When graduates were asked to identify which, if any, barriers occurred to their postgraduate engagement with their schools, overwhelmingly, we saw that most graduates, 80%, reported that they had at least one barrier. They named limited time at 44% and location and geography at 37% as the leading barriers. Nearly a quarter of graduates cited lack of interest at 23%, and then 15% identified their student debt as a barrier. And then we have some comments on the right-hand side. These are just some of the narrative comments that we collect throughout the data collection process. And you can see that they reflect many different areas, including receiving minimal outreach from the school or attempts to connect with the school unanswered. Primary communication that they receive from the school is request for donations. And then one alumni shared that the law school was just a very challenging time, and so they decide not to engage after.
Jennifer, another question popped in regarding definitions of mentoring in the survey. Did you do anything to define what that meant, whether it was alumni to student, alumni to alumni?
We didn't, it was just mentoring overall.
Okay. And then another question regarding the engagement statistics. Is it just, is it measuring what they prefer or what they've actually participated in thus far?
It's what they prefer. What would their preference be?
Thank you.
You're welcome. So when we look at the barriers to engagement by gender identity, as well as race and ethnicity, males graduates less often reported barriers overall. So 24%, about a quarter of them, said they did not, versus have any barriers, versus 18% of females, while all the non-binary graduates reported having at least one such barrier. Also, non-binary graduates reported lack of interest at 57% in that third column, at rates that were twice that of their male and female peers, where they were at 25% and 24%. Also, graduates of color noted limited time and lack of interest at lower rates at 40% than their majority peers did, and versus 47% for white graduates. And then we also saw some divergences when we look at within associates of color. Again, limited time and location and geography were the leading barriers for most of these cohorts, while MENA graduates, if we look way down in the bottom row over to the right, reported having no barriers at rates roughly twice that of the peers. It was at 53%. The others ranged from 0 up to 33%. Notably, all LGBTQ plus and graduates, as well as graduates with disabilities, stated that they had at least one such barrier to their post-graduation. LGBTQ plus graduates more often reported location and geography at 45% than did their overall class of 2020 peers, which was at 37%. And both LGBTQ plus and those with disabilities identified lack of interest at 30 and 29%, at rates higher than the entire class of 2020 did at 23%. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and go on to postgraduate sources. So we also examined career assistant levels. So how many have reached out for postgraduate career assistant by this point in time? And interestingly, unlike graduates prior to the pandemic, the majority of the class of 2020 reported that they had reached out to their law school for postgraduate career assistance. We can see in that chart, the column chart on the left, for the class of 2018, it was at 23%. It dipped down somewhat to 20% for the class of 2019. And then for the class of 2020, it jumped up to 52%, so over half. When we look on the right-hand side chart, this shows those that they've actually reached out to. So that a source that they've gone to for assistant, and faculty member and career service offices were the leading point of contacts for most at 27 and 34%. And while they've remained to be the leading points of contact over the years, for the class of 2020, these rates were much higher. And we also do have graduates that reach out to their alumni office at 10%, and then other administrative offices at 8%, or other sources at their school, an additional 10%. So we'll have the data broken out by gender identity, as well as race and ethnicity, and male and non-binary graduates reached out to faculty members at slightly higher rates than did their female peers. So 37 and 38% versus 32%. And graduates of color reached out to career services offices at higher rates than their white peers did as well, 31% versus 25%. Within graduates of color, although faculty and the career service offices were primary points of contact for most, we really did see those contact rates range considerably. For example, Asian and Latinx graduates contacted their faculty and career service offices at similar rates, about a third each. Black or African American and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander and multiracial graduates were more likely to reach out to faculty members compared to other sources, and MENA graduates were more likely to reach out to their career service offices at that 50% in the last row on the right, compared to other sources. Among both LGBTQ and those with disabilities, the two most frequently cited points were similar. They were the same with faculty and career service offices at about a third each. But these rates were higher than the rates that were reported for the overall general class of 2020. So we've given you a lot of data to look at and digest. We just wanted to mention schools are using our data in many different ways, and these are many different areas within the schools can utilize the data. Many thanks to those of you who are from schools that have participated in our study. If you have not, we would love you to join our study in the future, and Skip will be providing a few more details on that in a slide or two. Also, schools that participate in our study receive the aggregate data from a report detailing all of the data from all the schools that had participated for that particular year or class. We do not identify the schools by name, but we do aggregate their data and report it and slice it and dice it in many different ways. Also, the schools that participate receive a Taylor report with their own alumni's responses. So it's a school-specific report. So it really allows for rapid competitive benchmarking. They not only receive their empiric data, but all of their narrative responses as well. So now I'll turn it over to Skip.
So thank you, Jennifer. We want to get you to your breakouts soon. But after all that, it's hard to believe it's already time to launch our next alumni study for the class of 2021. As Jennifer mentioned, if any of your law schools would like to participate, it's not too late. We're going to be sending out invitations in November. We'd love to have as many law schools as possible participate. The more responses we have, the more robust the data is. So please drop us a note after the presentation, and we're happy to follow up with you. And then we've mentioned before, all of our resources, including the Law School Alumni Employment and Satisfaction Study, are on our website at www.nalpfoundation.org. And we'll turn it back over to Jamie and Heather for any questions, and then we'll go into breakouts.
Thank you so much. So we have been monitoring the chat just to see if there are any other additional questions that came in, and we're just about out of time. Let's just make sure we did define the mentoring program. So thank you. There was a question about the ranking tool. What ranking tool are you referencing? That was quite a few slides back. I don't know, Marianne, if you want to jump in to clarify what your question was.
So the ranking tool is the U.S. News and World Report rankings, flawed as they are and controversial as they may be, but still relevant for this class because they were still in effect as of 3 years ago.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So if folks are able to stick around and go into the breakouts, it looks like we got the official word. We are still going to do the breakouts. So thank you to Judy Asbury, who's going to lead the communications breakout session, Stephanie Silvestri, who will lead the Alumni Relations breakout session, and Mary Ann Soden, who will lead the Development Officers breakout. So you should see the Zoom breakout pop up to join the rooms. There we go. And we'll see you back here. Thanks so much.